Hi, this is Alex Bryan. Thank you all very much for registering for the webinar today regarding closing, nearshoring, relocating, and consolidating China-based operations supply chain. We've got a lot of people on the webinar today, so we'll jump right into it and get started. First, a couple of quick housekeeping things. There is a control panel you all have that governs ability to ask questions. We encourage questions all throughout the webinars, as everyone knows who has said all these before. Our webinars really are geared toward asking questions, so we've got a great set of panelists today. So if you see the control panel, there's an orange arrow, it's pointing left. Go ahead and click it and you'll see the questions. Ask those, they'll be texted to me and I will ask the speakers. And we already have a number of questions already in the hopper. That's point on the housekeeping. Briefly, our agenda today is we're going to provide a brief introduction of East West. There are a number of people on this who have registered who do not know who we are, so we're just going to provide a brief introduction of ourselves, about the webinar series we're doing, and then we're getting into an introduction to speakers. They're going to briefly address the global supply chain distribution situation as it is now, and why the topic we're talking about is relevant, and then we're going to open up the questions we have. So briefly, without any further delay, I'll jump in. This is a little bit about East West. East West operates in 5 markets, right? The U.S., China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. All the EWA executives have run companies on the ground in these 5 different markets. We've had P&L responsibilities for running companies on the ground. So we've had manufacturing facilities, supply chain operations, purchasing teams, distribution centers on the ground. We pulled from a variety of different companies throughout a variety of different companies here in the U.S. Some are very recognizable, like today, or Ashton Chemical and Eastman Kodak. We've got East West itself is broken down into 3 different practices. We've got the supply chain and operational. That covers all aspects of running a facility. That's building, closing, relocating facilities like we're talking about today. It covers performance improvement. It covers executive search for key executives. It covers supply chain, identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier audits, in our 5 different regions. Commercial side is more geared toward understanding what competitors are doing on the ground in different markets. So our researchers and teams on the ground are looking at how competitors are operating in the market. What's their go-to-market strategy, how they're selling the product, what's their distribution model, how they're manufacturing it, what they're importing. And then the third practice we have is risk management. And in each of the different areas where we operate, we've got a team of ex-military and ex-police that do a lot of background checks for us. That's primarily focused on suppliers and also new hires. Inevitably, we run into, on a very consistent basis, companies who have gone out and identified new suppliers. When we go back and look at who actually owns suppliers, we'll find the company may have brought on 3 new suppliers, and we find out all 3 are owned by the same family. So they think they're getting individual bids, but actually they're not. I started the company in 2005, so we're now in our 18th year, so we've got experience in a broad range of different industry sectors. Dan McLeod on the phone actually runs our chemical practice for us. Okay, here are the 5 areas where we operate. We talked about the United States, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, China, and Southeast Asia. On the webinar series, we do East West operates webinars all throughout the year. We're doing those really based on what our client needs are, trying to address what they're currently facing. So we'll do those throughout the year. Here's just a brief example of another 4 that are coming up. We've got for companies who are operating on the ground in China for China, meaning those companies whose markets are in China, they're manufacturing and selling into China for their market. We're going to look at a webinar coming up about restructuring, relocating within China. So a lot of people have suppliers as well as manufacturing operations that are affected by urban sprawl, or they're in locations that really don't want them, and we're going to investigate and show where regions are China are interested in having you come. Second is for companies who have plants on the ground in China, both in country, in China for China, and those who operate facilities. We're now going back into China for the first time in 3 years. People are going back to their facilities, and there's a lot of questions around this 3 years. Everyone's been operating by Zoom calls, and so people are coming to us and saying, "What kind of facility do I have now? What's the team that I've got? What kind of organizational assessments?" Because I haven't been on the ground there, and so we're finding in a lot of cases They have not actually gone after aggressively the commercial opportunities that exist and questions around the operational run, organizationally, how it's been managed. And companies are trying to get an analysis of what exactly they have now after not being in that market for 3 years, not being able to get over there. Third webinar, we'll be doing one on about in Vietnam, about development of manufacturing and supply chain base in Vietnam. It's been a core market for us. And then the fourth webinar we'll be doing is around electronic sourcing in China and Southeast Asia. And you can go on our website and sign up for future webinar notifications. If you do multiple webinars, those are just example 4 that we'll be doing coming up. All right, so now we'll get into the meats of this. Let me introduce the 2 speakers. We got 2 very sharp individuals, a lot to say and a lot of experience. Let me start off. Warren, if you please provide your background.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. My name's Warren Wisniewski. Previously, I was vice president of operations for Eastman Kodak Company across their Asia Pacific operations, in addition to a number of roles. I was based in Shanghai for over 15 years, and actually had P&L responsibility for Kodak's Asia Pacific operating businesses, and that went from Pakistan and India, South Asia to Australia, New Zealand, up to Northeast Asia in Japan and Korea, including China. Just prior to that, me taking over the P&L responsibilities, I actually built a manufacturing organization, predominantly in Asia, but we also had plants in other parts, predominantly in China, excuse me, but we also had plants in other parts of Asia as well. I built that to be an $800 million product bill, and in excess of 3,000 employees. During that whole period, we faced all the normal challenges that businesses would normally face, arriving in China, trying to grow your business as quickly as you can, reacting to things that change over for such a long period of time, both within your business as well as environmentally and operating cost-wise. So throughout that project, and in the end, we did a lot of restructuring and reorganization of our businesses there out of necessity. The tools that we deployed for all of that gave us a lot of experience as to how to accomplish the restructuring, consolidation, closure of our operations, including we carried out, did that through merger, through downsizing, through restructuring and closing of operations. So I think I've got a lot that I can hopefully share with all of you today during today's webinar.
That's great. Thank you, Warren. Dan, if you will also provide your background.
Sure. Dan McLeod, was based in Asia, lived in Asia and worked in Asia for 21 years. The majority of that time, 13 years in China, and the balance based in Southeast Asia, so I've worked around the region. Most of my experience has been with the chemical industry with Ashland and Hercules Incorporated, although I have got some experience in pharma, food manufacturing, and electrical equipment. But while there, primarily in the chemical, looked after operations, so that included managing capital projects to build facilities, staff them, start them up, and operate. In China, it was East China, Shanghai, Suzhou, Nanjing, and South China in Guangdong province. In addition to having responsibility for operations, from Australia up through Korea, through all of Asia. And during that time, had the opportunity to restructure and shut down some facilities, and so I have experience restructuring, shutting down facilities in China, both in southern China, in Guangdong and the Shanghai area, as well as other parts of Asia, Indonesia, Taiwan as well. So bring that experience to the discussion today.
That's great. Well, thank you both. We've got great speakers, and we got a lot of good questions and an awful lot of people on the line. So we'll move now to kind of the current global supply chain and distribution situation. We're going to briefly cover this and then dive into the questions we've got. I'll first turn it over to Dan McLeod. Dan, if you would talk a little bit about the current state, how we got here, and how that's currently affecting our business now.
Certainly. You know, the last few years have been difficult for a number of reasons. You know, globally, you know, inflation more recently, but generally trend of increased costs for labor, raw materials, and finished goods and everyone's supply chain. This has been really challenging in China, where in addition to general inflationary pressures, we've had disruptions from COVID and energy shortages and curtailments that have really made it a challenge for companies to operate consistently, and they're just coming back out of that now. This adds on the ongoing 2 decades of significant labor cost increases, where we're at a point now, certainly in the East China industrialized part of the country, heavily industrialized part of the country, wage rates are now higher than they are in developed economies such as Thailand and Southeast Asia, at or above what you're seeing in Mexico, and approaching what you would see for wage rates in Eastern Europe. So it's been a challenging time all around. And then certainly the impacts of tariffs the last several years, that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, and generally baked into companies' expectations and changed the way they've operated and how they've looked at their supply chains. And logistics costs, although they were very high a year or so ago, they've moderated, but still seeing delays, particularly in the West Coast of the US, where, again, continue to press companies to rethink what they're doing from a supply chain standard. And so many companies are looking at near sourcing or regional supply chains, getting away from that dependence. And we see that increased escalation in the last couple of years, particularly in our work in Vietnam and Mexico, where those economies, although are growing and they've got very good opportunities, they aren't as broad and as deep as China. So there's a real challenge to provide necessary in the supply, to provide a place and get the information for necessary and supplier base necessary for companies to land outside. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And of course, this is all less relevant for companies that are operating in China for their domestic market. But with the activity around move to nearshore, it's really pressing companies on their capital expenditure budgets. So they're taking a much harder look at what their expansion strategy or growth strategy is for their domestic markets. As they're being pulled in directions of, do we need to invest outside of China versus to continue to invest in their operations to support that domestic market.
Thank you, Dan. And I turn it over to Warren. Warren, if you would tackle a little bit of this.
Yeah, and what I like to do is just expanding on a point that Dan just talked about the uptake capability for the non-China or other than China destinations for operations. It's important to grasp the backdrop of China and what it's meant to manufacturing around the world and over the past at least past 2 decades, if not longer. And the title here, that there will never be another China, and I believe that there won't, just in terms of the sheer scale, the market potential, having a stable government in place for all this time that builds confidence. But that backdrop, if you compare that to the potential destination companies for this, we have to keep in mind the relative scale of this. Now, we also have to keep in mind that this didn't happen overnight in China. and it's not going to happen overnight in these other destinations, but growth will happen. In China, it took 40 years to develop where they are. But I'd like you to just point out in the chart on this page. This really paints the picture very well. This is of foreign direct investment flows into China as well as other emerging economies, and you can see from these numbers that even the biggest economies in possible consideration here are just a fraction of what China has become. From a manufacturing operations standpoint, China has such breadth of industrial participation across virtually all industries, and such depth to those industries in terms of not just final product completion, of course, but components, suppliers, equipment, tooling necessary for that, the engineering and management resources to support all of that. That's what's been grown over the past 40 years, and that's quite, frankly, the reason why it's become such a juggernaut. But the world has changed, and with what's happened geopolitically, economically, and right now we don't know how fast or quickly changes are going to happen, but it's necessary for companies to adapt to that change. And I want to emphasize, it's not impossible. East-West has helped many companies to make the transition very successfully, and there are destinations. The thing we have to keep in mind is that as moving operations out of China compared with moving things into China, we have to take a much more granular approach and look at what is your industry, what's the technology requirements, and where's the ultimate destination for your project, as well as the other economic factors to really have a successful move. Bottom line on that, of course, is the important thing is to make sure that you have access to the information and the expertise that you need, both on the sending end of this China as well as the receiving end.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that backdrop and with that explanation of kind of where we are, obviously, and where we're headed, I want to kind of get directly into the purpose of this webinar, which is the questions. And this is the Q&A discussion. Everybody who was registered got an email from me about the kind of questions and asking them if they have anything particular. We got a pretty significant response. I want to go over the questions we have now. I see a few people have already asked questions, but questions we've got now that for companies who are in China, right, for China, right, they're manufacturing product in China and selling them in China versus those who are manufacturing and exporting it significant. Assuming those are two kind of sectors, how are these companies looking at consolidation, closure, relocation? Because it affects both groups of people. Secondly, we're going to look at kind of the challenges, roadblocks for closing an operation. We're going to talk about maintaining operations all the way through production, because that's pretty critical. When we close factories, we also have to go through the process of keeping our suppliers fed throughout this whole process. We're looking at downsizing into something smaller, maybe not a full closure. Then we're going to look at relocation, specifically example one from China to Mexico. Then the next block, we're going to look at questions around moving equipment. Someone wanted to talk about specifically moving equipment out of China into other countries. Then we're going to talk about cases where we've had where manufacturers have partnered up with a Chinese supplier and gone to another location. We're talking about consolidations in one factory down to two. And then if China is not the right place, or countries like Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, are they also available? So without further, I'll jump right into it. And Warren, I'll ask you the first question.
Yeah.
For companies in China for China, right, those who are marketed in China, as well as those who are manufacturing or sourcing subcontracting in China and then exporting that, they're obviously all looking at closures, consolidations, relocations. Can you talk a little bit about how they're looking at that and what they're actually doing, and give a couple of examples of what they're actually implementing on the ground?
Yeah, let me just start briefly talking about those companies in China for China. And I know that's not the primary focus of this webinar, but for those, and again, that means companies that are there primarily for serving the marketplace and growing their business domestically in China. For at least as long as I've been involved in China, it's always been an extremely hyper-competitive market, particularly with respect to the domestic environment. Clearly, anybody who's trying to make a go of it in the China market, they have to be on top of their game, because it's not, you're facing literally thousands of hungry domestic competitors as well as your international competition. What has evolved in China, both in terms of gaining operating efficiency, as well as in terms of tapping into new market potential, is as China has grown, it's the action started in the coastal areas, but and actually the government has made a focus of this, is developing well beyond those areas to central China, northeastern China, even into southern, southwestern and western China. So for companies in China for China, the key to their successes, I think, increasingly lie with them looking inland, both in terms of gaining lower costs, because there are lower operating costs, labor as well as facilities and so on, but at the same time as the manufacturing economies inland have grown, have developed, the market, the surrounding market has grown, which provides an upside in terms of revenue potential for those companies. So the focus there is really looking at inland, which then drives the need for what do you do with your existing operations that are located more in coastal areas, which is the focus of this discussion. For the exporting companies, and some have one foot in both sides of that equation, but increasingly more and more companies are looking to find alternative areas. And as I said prior, once you've made the decision, you've identified a good location to go to, then you have to deal with all the issues around what do you do with your existing operations. And I think we'll be talking more about that here shortly. So let me leave it with that. And
Warren, I think we're seeing like examples. If you're in China for China, we're seeing a number of those companies say maybe consolidate 1 to 3 factories into one, or 2 factories into one, or relocating their facility from Shanghai or Suzhou out. And then for those that are export born, either they, or in some cases they're closing facilities. East West is closed or relocated 55 different factories throughout China. We did one in January. We're doing now one in February. And in that case, the company is actually leaving China, right? But a lot of them are, even if they're exporting, they are in the process of maybe consolidating some companies, or they're going to close the factory and relocate to Thailand. We're doing something like that. Those are kind of examples I would think of how companies are kind of looking at closures, relocations, consolidations, no matter if they're export oriented or in China for China. Right. And so if you're looking at that closure, then what's kind of the methodology, the challenge? Look at the question 2, the roadblock for closing. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, and that gets to the crux of the issue of how do you close an operation. And I've done carried out a number of these that I was directly responsible, ranging anywhere from operations that had 200 people all the way up well over 1,000 people. It's to do it successfully. I think many of us are all aware of some of the the unsuccessful cases, because those get published, where general managers get held captive by the employees to try to work out better solutions. The important thing to avoid those situations is the process that you use to get through that, so you don't have those situations. We typically use follow basically a three-phase process, and they're equally important. They take different periods of time, different lengths of time, but they just obviously there's an awful lot to this, but I'll just touch on a couple of points from each of them. In the first phase, it's this is the critical phase where you've made the decision to close the operation, and the most important thing here is to identify the core team of people who are going to carry that out on the ground for you, and you need to identify people that you trust, and you have to put in place plans to make sure that they stay. Those are not typically financial plans with contracts that have a final payout at the end when they've successfully completed what all that was agreed to. That's a critical part of getting the team. Getting government buy-in up front. In China, the government has its hand in everything, and so it's critically important that you maintain good relations with the government, get them on board, get them supportive. They don't want to see things go out of control any more than you want to. They may not want you to be happy about you leaving, but the important thing is getting their engagement. And finally, in that phase, really developing a proper, an appropriate severance plan for the region that you're in. And Dan, I know you've got some experience on this that you might want to share just briefly.
Yes. I mean, certainly there's regulatory guidelines on what and formulas on what severance you need to be provided. But what we found is companies that go through this process the most smoothly generally offer a little bit more fair than the requirement, so they're deemed, but understand the precedents locally going into it. It can be as problematical for the local government if you're offering much more than sort of the standard in the area, because that creates problems down the road for the government in the case of future shutdowns in their neighborhood. So you really want to do your homework up front, understand what the not just the legal requirements, but what's typical and normal in the area that you're working in.
Thanks, Dan. Let me move on to the second phase. The first phase, by the way, typically would take if you're focused and you get it done focused, and you have everything in place you need, about 2 to 3 months. In the second phase, this is when you actually roll out the public announcement about what you're going to do. Again, I've had a number of experiences, actually 2 experiences, one in Shanghai and another down the coast across from Taiwan in Xiamen, both affecting more than 1,000 people. In cases like that, large scale cases like that, in my case, what we decided to do is break the announcement down into smaller groups of people. Simple human behavior experiment, but it worked very successfully for both of us. Again, going into that, having the government buy-in, because they're interested in making sure this doesn't go out of control. But it makes for a long day for management. I personally, running multiple factories, but I personally was involved in each and every stage of that. The one in Shanghai, we had 1,300 employees. Broke that down into 10 groups of 130. where we did that announcement, makes 10 similar announcements, one right after the other. And as they come out of the announcement, we have the severance package. We explain it in the announcement. We have the paperwork required for them to sign up to that, and hopefully, at least in our case, it went very well. So that second phase and then rolling out the communications out beyond to your suppliers and all the local constituents and regulatory agencies, which of course the government has helped you with. That can take about 4 weeks. In the phase 3 this is the heavy lifting part. This is where you have to actually execute, which means typically if you have a plan to run out production, running out that production successfully so that it's not delayed, you meet your schedules, there are no quality issues, disposing of assets and equipment, and then finally mopping up the book, so to speak, with respect to the local tax authorities, duties and customs, and any overhanging issues that you might have with any of the regulatory agencies.
Warren, it's appreciate that explanation, because when we closed last month in January, it had 100 people in it.
Mm-hmm.
The process though was the exact same, right?
Yep.
We're doing one now in February that's going to have 50 people. The process will be exact same. The timing is going to be the exact same. And that last phase 3, it may take 6 months, 9 months, a year, but it's intermittent. It's not a full time, but it's a lot of the stuff that the office is just having to run down. Thank you for that. So Dan, let me ask you a question. When you're closing, how can you maintain, this is a key point, maintain the operation, schedule through production, people who know you're closing? How do you maintain that operation? Because we have to still supply customers during this whole process.
Yeah, certainly. And starts with what Warren was talking about, the planning phase, and there are certain cases where you may get away with less time, but normally we've seen it hard to execute with less than 2 to 3 months notice to develop plans, and that requires get a cross-functional team together up front that really includes some of your operations, your sales, your materials management, your production planning people, so that you can develop detailed plan for building inventory and getting it to where it needs to be post-closure. Second item I'd say would be critical is to maintain confidentiality on this. And so you really want to minimize any disruptions that you could have if the word leaks out. And then converse of that, to have a contingency and communications plan is if something from a leak standpoint happens, what are you going to tell people, and have that prepared in advance. Normally there's an inventory build. There's a strong transition plan there, and some of the things you need to consider is how you're going to build it. Usually, and so it can be done in some cases with outsourcing, but again, that takes time to execute. And where are you going to stock and store that inventory? So are you going to ship it to downstream consumers? You're going to ship it offsite to warehouses? And in a couple of cases I've managed, we looked at offsite inventory holding, and we found that for a couple of reasons. One, there's just the matter of space you may have in your factory and existing warehouses. But the other thing is there's a risk management aspect to that, where if you've gone to the expense of building inventory, you want to keep it away from your factory in case there is some sort of disruption where traffic in and out through the closure process gets disrupted. You want to have that inventory remote. So those are a couple of things that we've considered and put into our plans and execute successfully.
And if everybody on there, Dan's had a few issues where the volume comes in and out. Dan's in Maine today, and It is getting ready to drop 50 degrees today in Maine. So bear with it. It's so wherever you are today, if it's not dropping 50 degrees, you're doing better than they are in Maine right now. Warren, let me jump to you on the next question. It talks about companies that are trying to downsize from full scale operating to something smaller. How are companies are doing that, and why are they doing that?
Yeah, so for companies in those situations, it could be for business reasons. It could be because they're moving operations, but moving operations out of the country to Vietnam or Mexico or central somewhere in Central or Eastern Europe, but they want to maintain a presence in China, for example, continuing to support source anything from finished product to components, so not fully exiting the operation. We have to remember in China, of course, every business requires a business license. Every business license has a defined scope. Business licensing 101 says that when you set your license up, you want the scope to cover as much as you can. But when you're going in the other direction and downsizing, you may no longer have the operation structure to support all of that, and the government will require you to revise the scope of your license. You need to remember that you just can't back away from things. Remember, the government has its hand in an awful lot there. I had one operation in a small town just south of Shanghai where now this was in China for China, but I think the lessons are the same. Where we wanted to downsize that. It was a vertically integrated operation, component manufacturing as well as final assembly and test, and we wanted to get away from the component manufacturing portion of that. And again, that was primarily because of economics, primarily because we wanted to. We saw an opportunity to consolidate that with another operation, which we ended up doing actually through a legal entity merger in the process very successfully.
All right. One of the questions just popped in, so I'll insert that in before the next question. This was talking about that this executive saying on the top of the mind now is for closures and exit dynamics from China. How is that changing or being affected by the hawkish position between the U.S. and China regarding Taiwan? They say, I suspect it's top of mind for many executives, given the news yesterday on increasing military presence in the Philippines. So if you all would talk about that, how that is affecting companies' ability to close factories, relocate factories, consolidate facilities.
Yeah, Alex, let me take a swing at that one. It's pretty clear. I mean, not only my own direct experience with this, but other people I know, and certainly across East West, things have changed pre-pandemic to post-pandemic because in parallel that a lot of the political tensions have come along with the changes that the pandemic brought for us. Now, as China has exited the pandemic, it's interesting for me and for others who've watched China over decades, the jump from being zero COVID to being totally open, to me it's exceptional. It's like something I've never seen the Communist Party of China do over all those years. Everything is typically gradual, and I think what that speaks to is their concern about the economic situation in China and getting the economy back on its feet. I don't believe that they would have considered doing that if the economic situation wasn't as dire. So they're clearly focused on that now. the Vice Premier Liu spoke, I believe, the week before last at Davos at the World Economic Forum, and given what we've been through over the past 3 years, quite remarkable to hear him say that China's open for business and it's going to be business as usual. And now time will tell if those words have substance behind it, but I believe that again, looking at the history of China, the one thing the party is interested fundamentally in one thing, and that's maintaining social stability and order. The game plan for that has been maintaining economic activity to keep people and jobs and their lives improving, at least economically. And they've never been at a juncture like this before. So I think it's a reasonable expectation to believe that it will change. Let me add one other personal experience from this is when I was in China, we've been through periods where things happened that created tension between the governments of the U.S. and China. If you recall, there was an incident with a Chinese fighter bumping into an American reconnaissance plane off Hainan Island in the south. And I was involved in some fairly significant business activities with my government counterparts, and at that time they actually and I've seen this happen before. They remind us that look, business is business and politics are politics, and so I think you'll see the same thing happening here if my experience is any indication to that.
You think they'll make it a little tougher, but it's not going to affect the ability to get in the way of doing this?
Yeah, I think we have to remain cognizant of that the world has changed around us, and one thing about going into China, if you're an American or from anywhere else, you need to have cultural sensitivity. Similarly, I think you have to have sensitivity to the tensions that exist there. But again, they're focused on generating economic activity. You're focused on improving your business, and that's where the focus should remain.
Dan, getting to we're kind of now been addressing about closing. Can you talk a little bit about on this last question here about relocating? We work now with some companies going from China to Mexico. Can you talk specifically about that when they're closing or relocating from China to Mexico? Some of the specific risks involved and the roadblocks you face when companies are doing that.
Sure. So we talk about moving from China to Mexico. Again, theme being that Mexico has got a very broad manufacturing sector. Number of key sectors are represented there and well developed. But again, it's 1/10 the size of China from a population standpoint. So you don't have the breadth of the supply base. So it's important. We see it's important for folks going there to first thoroughly do thorough understanding of their potential supplier base, where it's located, their capabilities, what they are capable of, and with an understanding that some certain basic materials that are used in the sector are probably imported now and are going to continue to be imported. Basic electronic components primarily come from South China. They're going to continue to come there from some period of time. So you're going to be somewhat beholden on imports, but a thorough understanding base is important, particularly in the last few years where inquiries to suppliers from not just folks looking to relocate from Asia, but U.S. companies that are looking to expand south. Those inquiries are coming fast and furious, and it's slowing down the response. So it's a little harder to develop those relationships and understand the capabilities. Another aspect that companies that have been operating in China for several years and they're looking to expand into Mexico that can be surprised by, it could be a risk, is availability of utilities, power, gas, water. In many cases, they're not they're not universally available across the country. So that enters into your site selection a much higher frequency, much higher concern than you might see in other parts of the world, particularly around China. The last few years, there's been significant competition for locations, for land, for resources, with companies looking to relocate, and not just Western companies that are looking to relocate from Asia into Mexico, but also Asian companies, Chinese companies that are looking to move there. And so the competition extends across the country. So it makes it a little more complicated to find the right fit for you. So it may take a little bit more time than you used to evaluate that. And then I guess finally, a risk or a surprise for people is that to try to fully understand the options to setting up your business. There's a variety of models that you can use in Mexico that are somewhat different than you would experience in other parts of the world. And certainly when you compare it to China, the transparency, the clarity, the structure around setting up a business and the timetables for doing so are less clear and more extended. So having an understanding of those early on in the process helps set expectations and develop a realistic timetable to make that relocation. So,
Yeah, and I would add one thing on that. I know when we've done these relocations to Mexico, supply chain is such a key piece of this, right? Because you're trying to get the right suppliers, and Mexico is not an alternative to China for everything, right? It's got great pockets, but China, just the breadth and scale of China, Mexico certainly doesn't have that. So you really got to know where your supply chain is as you're moving in there. Okay, so as you're talking about this, you're talking about relocations and closures. Dan, talk a little bit about moving manufacturing equipment, if you would, out of China to another country. Obviously, we've done 50 plus of these different locations, and we've had good success getting equipment out of there. But there are some cases, particularly the tooling side, where it's a much different story.
Yeah, and in general, it's usually you don't run into a problem. What you need to be aware of is you need to comply with the regulations and requirements of the country you're attempting to export to, and so that would require certified assessors to evaluate the condition of the equipment and the value of the equipment, so that the appropriate duties can be applied on the country you're shipping it to. But by and large, the Chinese authorities don't get in the way of that. Where we've run into complications, and I know, Warren, you've had some experience of this, is where the equipment or the tooling, you may own it or think you own it, but it may not physically be. So recovering that has been a challenge for companies in the past. I know, Warren, you've had some experience with that as well.
Yeah, and the solution to avoiding that, I mean, if you're having that problem, I think you just got to tough it out and find legal or other means to extract that. But the solution to preventing that is doing your work up front with the supplier. When you establish those supplier relationships, and I think that this goes for any country that you would be operating in. And if you are assigning assets to that supplier to use to supply you, the critical part of that is the supply agreements and the terms around ownership of the tools, and what the supplier's rights are and what the owner's rights are to those tools when it comes time to having to either dispose or move those assets. So the solution to that really is having good supply agreements that pay as much attention to that issue around the tooling and equipment as it does around the components and pricing and quality standards that you're going to define for the components. So as typically, it's as usual, it's do the work up front, and you can avoid those problems.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had cases like that. We've had someone just texted a question of that they had someone had tooling. They had tooling in a Chinese supplier's facility, and then the supplier went out of business, and they're struggling to get that tooling out of there. And Warren, have you ever run across that, or Dan, have you ever run across that scenario?
I haven't, but again, the only comment I would make is when a supplier runs out of business, it becomes the lawyer's realm, right? A lawyer's job, and so your best friend in cases like that are having the legal boilerplate in place to support you as that gets sorted out of the supplier.
Yes.
All right. Dan, we've had a couple scenarios where U.S. manufacturers are looking to relocate beyond China, and in some cases, they're taking their Chinese suppliers with them, whether we're talking about Vietnam, for example, or Mexico. So that's come up a couple times. It's an interesting scenario when we're trying to relocate someone. Can you talk about a couple of those cases? Obviously, we know why they're doing it, but kind of the challenges of doing that, what's working and what's not working.
Yeah. Yes. We've had experience with clients that have moved into Vietnam and into Mexico and working with their local partner, Chinese, not a legal partner, but a key strategic supplier. I guess the most important aspect of that is that one of the parties needs to either be established or have relationships or some level of comfort and knowledge of the destination country. And so in the case of companies moving into Vietnam, it's not unusual for the Chinese company to have either relationship either through a sister company or industry or trade associations or previous experience there. And that seems to work best if there's a general similarity in government structure, permitting structure, cultural affinity. So that tends to work okay in Vietnam. We also have worked with a client that had an established operation in Mexico. They'd been in Mexico for just a few years. They'd been very successful and grown significantly in China for over 20 with a supplier in China. And as they grew in Mexico, they essentially, it made economic sense for them to move that supplier and co-locate with them in Mexico rather than continuing to import the product from overseas. And so they facilitated that move, co-located on the same property, and that went very, very well. And that was a case where, again, the U.S. company was well established and for 3 years in Mexico, and so they felt comfortable, and so that smoothed that transition for a Chinese supplier. So I guess so bottom line is it would be risky, and it would be risky if neither company had a foothold or experience into the destination country. But as long as one's got a relationship in one of the countries, then it seems to work quite well.
I would just add that if fundamentals, if you are considering working with your partner, I think you want to look deeply into that relationship, and obviously the longer the relationship has been and the degree of trust that you've that flows both ways is an essential ingredient to doing that. So you don't want to rush into something like that. You're in a hurry to make a move. You've got a partner who you've only worked with for not that long a period. Trust is actually absolutely essential here in making that work.
Yeah, so we had we talking about the relocation. So we have questions just pop up here. We've got someone online. They've got a facility of 250 people. They're looking at closing. They're outside Suzhou electronics sector. One of the things that's concerning is they said is getting clarity on the severance package, because they had the situation they're in. They had a general manager leave, and they had, the concern was the general manager had made some side agreements with several of the employees there, right? Which we've seen happen before. So the concern is, how do they get, what are your opinion on how they would get those employees corralled so that they are in line with everyone else? Because their fear is when they announce that these additional employees are going to come say, well, I've got these side agreements. If they actually do have side agreements, the other employees will hear about it, and that'll cause chaos in the closure. Either one of you have opinions on that?
Dan,
That's a
you
hard
anything to
question.
take a swing? Otherwise, I can chirp in.
I mean, sure. I mean, one of the key elements of, when we work with folks to develop a plan is the HR piece, and we go in early enough to try to do our best to uncover those sorts of situations. And side agreements is one point. Compliance with benefits and overtime policies is another. We try to understand that as far as advance so we can attempt to work through those and negotiate, or at least have a plan for negotiating in advance. So I guess the only thing I'd say is having a solid HR person there in China that can go through the details and interview people and try to uncover those inconsistencies early as possible will allow you to plan for it, manage it.
Yeah, I think another element to this, particularly if you've got an ex-employee who was acting out of step. Again, you'd like to try to resolve this yourself independently, but remember, any particularly with a downsizing or closure of an operation, your local government contacts, it's essential that they remain involved. And quite frankly, part of that, one component of that is the Public Security Bureau, which is there to maintain order. The government, as I said before, the government doesn't want to see something disorderly any more than you do. So I think in dealing with an issue where something supposedly was promised behind the scenes, make sure you've got, as you work to resolve that, make sure you've got in place the support you need from the government, and if that needs to go as far as from the Public Security Bureau as well, just to keep a lid on things, those are necessary steps.
Yeah, I know in the closure we did a couple weeks ago in January, we had the Labor Bureau there, and we had some private security there, just because we had a number of welders who were in their 50s and were getting laid off, and that can be a tough group. The question popped up around, have we ever come across violence on a closure, right? Because we read stories about that. You're closing, you've got people, maybe a small group, but some of them will get violent as far as trying to damage equipment, as far as trying to, in case you always hear about something getting locked in a closet, but damaging equipment, hurting people. Have you all come across that, and kind of the case would happen?
I've been fortunate. The only incident I had personally close to that was we had just made a conversion of some of our supporting employees from being direct employees to being working for another contractor, and in the process of doing that, actually we had the vice mayor of Shanghai. We were giving him a tour through our factory, and one of the wives of an affected employee, just as the mayor was coming into our operation, came in, and you'll see this in China. You'll have won't be the employee, but it might be their spouse or something, comes in and tries to create a scene, which was that was the closest I ever got, fortunately. But it was looking back, it was a rather humorous incident.
Dan, have you ever come across that? We've had.
Well, I haven't in my experience. I know we've gone in sort of after the fact. If a closure plan hasn't been well planned and communications solid in place, there've been there have been issues that we've been involved in cleaning up after the fact, certainly. And that's when I get back to the planning stages. A couple of things key from an HR standpoint. You know, one of the exercises we go through is we try to identify the potential troublemakers up front and try to develop planning around that. And then from a security standpoint, generally advise not to do announcements on the factory so that people are off-site, so they don't. And then we can secure the factory while people are away and provide limited access as needed for people to come in, monitored and limited access as needed for people to come back as needed for personal belongings or whatnot effects. So really try to separate an announcement from the company assets, so that in case there's any activity, it doesn't spill over into a factory and cause damage to equipment or facilities. So those are a couple of things that we look at to try to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, I know the one we did a few last year during COVID, and it was tough to do off-site because we couldn't go to a hotel, right? Because the hotels didn't want us gathering there to lay people off. So in some cases we had to do it at the factory, but we'd have to sequester them somewhere else in the factory, not in the plant itself, because that's the fear was they would start damaging the equipment. But look, I know it's 12 o'clock exactly, so those people the webinar is officially over. We've got 2 or 3 more questions. I will just keep asking Dan and more the questions but the webinar is now officially over. Thank you for attending. But we got these questions, and so I want to keep answer them as they've come in. So the next question is we had earlier, more of this to you, about consolidating two factories into one. Can you talk about doing that successfully while keeping there are a number of stakeholders in that, but when you're doing that, how do you keep particularly the supplier supportive of this?
Yeah, and first and foremost is going back to something that I talked about earlier, is internally, you've obviously created a vision of what the future holds for that operation post consolidation. So a critical part of that is again being able to communicate to suppliers and other constituents in the process. Paint a picture that while this is in the short term, it may appear that you are downsizing or restructuring in a way that doesn't appear to be supportive of growth, being able to explain how that happens. And one of my personal experiences, I think, illustrates this pretty well. This goes back to, I was talking about the small operation that we wanted to separate the component manufacturing from the final product assembly and test, and consolidate that into a different area. First of all, number one, we had the advantage that the organization we consolidated into was already pre-existing. So if it becomes more complex, if you're starting with 2 operations, consolidating them into one in a totally new location, that becomes more of a challenge. But in our case, we actually the component manufacturing that we were getting away from, sold the assets of that business to the local zone development corporation where it was coming from, gave them a supply agreement that kept them happy. But our strategy in doing that was this was a company making fairly large scale equipment. It was photographic equipment, 1-hour photo processing equipment, and that was an in China for China business. What we wanted to do was leverage the capability we had in that to cut across our other businesses. For example, health imaging, digital health imaging equipment, which is a similar scale. We had a document imaging scanning business that were all related, and so that was our strategy. Ultimately, by making that move, consolidating, downsizing, getting selling off some assets, we actually created a far healthier business with a far broader base of activity.
Do that consolidation. Yeah.
Right, right.
So the last question here we've got, someone had asked us, we got up here, and it says, if China becomes unviable for your business, is there another country like Brazil, India? I think we're going to replace that. We're going to really look at other countries in, say, Southeast Asia, Mexico, or Eastern Europe. And then if you would take that, I think look in those three areas, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. Can one of those locations replace China if your business becomes unviable there?
None of them have the same scale. When you look at Southeast Asia, although it is a very significant market, so it's 600 million people and it's growing at 5 to 6% a year. So it's an intriguing and interesting opportunity for companies that want to expand in there and move from China into there to take advantage of that market. In that case, but it's really some of the things you look for is, okay, where are your customers? Are you getting close to your customers? Is there, from a treaty standpoint, is there the advantages there? And there are in many cases Thailand and trade relations with the U.S., Vietnam, trade relations to the U.S. So favorable status. So those are a couple areas, and we've had success moving companies from China into Thailand, which has got if you're great supplier base in automotive, appliance sector, petrochemicals, chemical sector, and then in Vietnam where you've got established businesses like the garment industry, the furniture industry, and now emerging electronic assembly. The advantage is there again. You've got access to a growing market. You get good trade relationships with the U.S., but you're also still relatively close to a supplier component base in China, so you wouldn't necessarily have to change all your supply chain or localize all your supply chain. You're close enough to take advantage of that. In the case of Mexico, as we mentioned, you get a very broad manufacturing capability, but you got to pick your spots. There are certain clusters, areas of expertise, whether it's everything from a lot of automotive, certainly, but appliance industry, which is well established, but then more recent growth industries, aerospace, medical devices, electronic assembly, certainly is big there. So on your manufacturing sector, can be a great fit there, but it's not, you can't cover everything there. And then when you get into Central Europe, Poland, where we've got a lot of experience, traditional industries around metalworking, fabrication, castings, machining, great source, great infrastructure there. And one of the real advantages we've seen there is for consumer product, particularly your logistic costs and access from Central Europe into Western European markets are great. There's been a lot of investment in transportation infrastructure by the EU in the last 15 years. It's made travel times quite favorable from Central and Eastern Europe going into markets in the West. So again, it can provide good access to your end market by operating there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of the company we've taken to Thailand, Vietnam. It's because they wanted to get into that market, and they may have also been supplying the China market, but they had a big customer base in Southeast Asia, and they knew if they were making in Southeast Asia and exporting back to the U.S., they're not dealing with tariffs, they're not dealing with challenges. I think, Dan, you're using an early example about the electronic space, right? Working within Vietnam, yeah. They're able to get into China, get the raw materials, but bring it for assembly into Vietnam and get it to the U.S. market.
Right. The major investment there has been in the northern part of the country, where you've got truck traffic time 10 to 12 hours from major electric components in South China. So, those roads are full of transportation. You could also bring it in by water, but typically truck it in so you've got same day delivery of key components, but at a more favorable trade regime in Vietnam.
And all those three places, whether moving into Thailand, Vietnam, whether we move people into Mexico, we move people into Southeast, and move them into Central Eastern Europe, all of them is because they've had a local customer base, right? That's there.
Yes.
Mexico,
Yes.
North America, Central Eastern Europe for Western Europe. All right, Warren and Dan, look, I know we've gone well overboard, but I appreciate you all answering the questions that we got. We kept getting questions, so I want to keep answering them. Appreciate you all taking the time. This concludes the East West webinar. I appreciate people staying on. There will be a survey sent to you. Please fill it out. And again, thank you all very much for taking the time. This concludes the webinar as of today. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.